Hello, and welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Honest, and thank you for being here, truly. I want to ask you something before we dive in. Do you consider yourself a good judge of character? Can you tell when someone is performing versus when they're being real? Think about it, and tell me in the comments. I find it fascinating. If you're enjoying the channel, please subscribe. We're building something lovely here together. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. There are villages in England where nothing very much happens, and where, for that precise reason, the smallest alteration in tone can ring like a cracked cup on a breakfast tray. St. Honors was such a place. It lay folded among low hills and orchards, with a church of warm stone, a green that looked innocent from every angle, and a society arranged as carefully as jars upon a pantry shelf. There was the vicar and his earnest wife. There was Colonel Dace, who had retired from active usefulness into the management of committees. There was Mrs. Piper of the post office, through whom every fact passed whether invited or not. And there was Mrs. Arabella Harbury, whose position in the village had the polished inevitability of silver laid out for company. Mrs. Harbury had been a widow for 8 years. Her husband, a solicitor of moderate distinction and excellent habits, had left her the big house at the edge of the lane, a competent income, and the sort of name that conferred moral authority upon any woman clever enough to wear it well. Arabella wore it perfectly. She chaired subscriptions, visited the housebound, arranged soup in cold weather, flowers in illness, blankets in rain, and practical cheerfulness in all seasons. No one could accuse her of indolence, and nobody in St. Honors would have dreamed of accusing her of insincerity. If she was not loved, she was something more durable in village life, approved. That June, she had launched the Vale Cottage Relief Appeal, which was to raise funds for repairs to the crumbling cottage of Miss Elspeth Vale, who had been taken poorly in the spring. The thing had every appearance of goodness. Elspeth Vale was old, rheumatic, and dignified in the particular manner of people long accustomed to scarcity. Her roof let in water. Her chimney smoked badly. Her unmarried granddaughter, Miss Ruth Vale, had returned from teaching in Cheltenham to see after her. Mrs. Harbury, hearing of the matter, had at once set a fund in motion. There were collection envelopes in the church porch, a benefit tea proposed for July, and a committee meeting to be held in the vicarage garden on a Thursday afternoon. Miss Marple attended because Mrs. Vicar had asked her, and because such gatherings were exactly the sort of thing one attended if one lived respectably in a village and was of use in practical small matters. She sat a little to the side beneath a striped awning, where one could be near enough to hear without ever appearing to listen. There was sponge cake, and there were plates of buttered scones, and there were those agreeable little expressions of communal duty which make English country life appear, from a distance, like a series of embroidered cushions. Miss Marple, who knew the stuffing of many such cushions, stirred her tea and observed. Mrs. Harbury was in excellent form. She moved from group to group with that measured warmth which seems spontaneous only to those who have never practiced it. She placed a hand briefly upon Mrs. Piper's sleeve while inquiring after her sciatica. She thanked Colonel Dace for his sensible offer of transport. She praised the vicar's wife for the neatness of the subscription list. She said, with a pretty gravity, that one must all rally round poor dear Elspeth, who had given so much quiet service in former years and asked so little now. Then Ruth Vale arrived late through the side gate, apologizing for the delay because her grandmother had had a difficult morning. She was a tall young woman with dark hair pinned anyhow, and the sort of face which looked handsome rather than pretty when at rest. She was plainly tired. Miss Marple noticed, because she noticed such things, that Ruth had done her best to make herself fit the occasion. Her dress had been brushed, her collar fresh, her gloves mended. There was something in that care which Miss Marple admired. Mrs. Harbury turned toward her with a smile already in place. "My dear Miss Vale, of course. We quite understand." The words were right. The voice was right. The smile remained. And there, just for a second, something altered. It was not enough to call rudeness. No one present would have done so. But the smile stayed on Mrs. Harberry's face a fraction too long after Ruth had finished speaking, as though it had been set there for the room rather than called forth by the girl herself. Her eyes, meanwhile, did not warm. They merely rested. One might have said she was tired. One might have said nothing at all. Ruth took the one empty chair and sat. Mrs. Harberry resumed outlining plans for the appeal. There would be a small concert in the assembly room, she thought. Also a produce table. She herself would underwrite the roofer's first call-out so that work might begin quickly. How fortunate, she added, that Miss Vale had returned just when she was most needed. The phrase was gracious. Yet Miss Marple saw Ruth's shoulders stiffen as if at a cold draft. Presently the discussion turned to practicalities. Colonel Dace proposed that Ruth, being nearest to the circumstances, might act as liaison with tradesmen. Mrs. Harberry said at once, "Perhaps it would spare Miss Vale if I undertook that side of things. She has enough upon her hands. Again, kind. Again, entirely proper. Again, not quite right." Ruth said, "I should not mind." Mrs. Harberry's smile remained, pale and complete. "No, dear girl, but one does not always know when one is overburdened." There was a little murmur of approval. Women enjoy self-sacrifice very much when it is performed tidily by another woman in front of them. Miss Marple, looking down at the thin spread of jam on her plate, thought that Mrs. Harberry had not once asked Ruth what her grandmother wanted. That was the one thing. The meeting drifted on. Rain threatened, did not fall, and retreated again. Mrs. Piper said that if enough cherries were ready she could spare some for the tea. The vicar's wife worried over chairs. Colonel Dace believed the piano could be borrowed from the schoolroom. Nothing happened. Nothing happened at all. And yet when Miss Marple rose, thanked her hostess, and walked home by the lower lane bordered with cow parsley and late roses, she carried with her a distinct sense of discomfort. At home she set the kettle on, cut herself a modest slice of fruit cake, and sat by the window that looked over her small front garden. The delphiniums were showing promising color. A blackbird hopped among the borders with businesslike resentment. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and went over the afternoon. Mrs. Harberry had been faultless. That, in itself, meant very little. Many people were faultless in public because public life supplied them with rules. It was what Mrs. Harberry had not done that lingered in Miss Marple's mind. She had not once addressed Ruth Vale as if Ruth possessed authority over her grandmother's own life. She had extended concern to Elspeth Vale in every direction except through the granddaughter nearest to her. It was like seasoning a dish carefully and omitting salt only from one corner of the pan. Miss Marple did not say to herself that there was a mystery. She never did when there was one. She merely thought that something had shifted slightly beneath the village surface, and that Mrs. Arabella Harberry, who was so particularly good at being what she appeared to be, had shown the tiniest seam in the stitching. Then she asked herself whether there was any more cake, and found that there was not. Chapter 2. By the following week St. Honors had entered that agreeable phase of organized benevolence in which every conversation begins with weather and ends with money. The Vale Cottage Relief Appeal advanced smartly. Notices appeared beside the church lich gate. Mrs. Piper displayed a collecting tin by the till. Mrs. Harberry's name lent the thing momentum, and the village, pleased to be led in a good cause, followed in correct formation. It was impossible not to admire the efficiency with which she transformed sentiment into arrangements. And yet people spoke, very lightly, of Ruth Vale. Not unkindly. Village people are often at their most destructive when they are least aware of it. And the remarks that began to circulate had that polished harmlessness which does harm precisely because it sounds so innocent. Ruth was thought capable, but perhaps rather abrupt. Devoted, certainly, but under strain. Proud, maybe. One heard that Mrs. Harberry had tried to help and been met with reserve. One heard that poor Miss Vale did not always see what was best for the old lady. One heard, too, that Elspeth had grown peculiar and did not like tradesmen in the house. Miss Marple heard all this without encouragement, chiefly from Mrs. Piper, who delivered social speculation the way other women delivered parcels. They met in the post office on Monday morning, where Miss Marple had gone for stamps. "It's a blessing Mrs. Harbury has taken it in hand," said Mrs. Piper, weighing a packet of needles for some unknown customer. "That girl means well, no doubt, but there's something tight about her. Not natural, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple, who very often knew exactly what people meant and usually thought less of it than they did, said mildly, "Nursing the old is tiring work." "Well, yes, but one needn't make a parade of being burdened." "Did she make a parade?" Mrs. Piper paused, slightly checked. "Not in so many words. But one feels it." Miss Marple bought her stamps and thought that one very often felt what one had first been taught to notice. On Wednesday, there was a small disturbance at the Ladies' Working Society in the parish room, though the members would not have called it such. Miss Marple attended because she had promised some jars of gooseberry jelly for the refreshment table at the July tea, and because the parish room was a dependable place in which to learn what a village was thinking before it knew it was thinking it. The long table at the center was heaped with hemming, labels, raffle books, and patterns for aprons nobody truly needed. Windows stood open to a mild afternoon. One could smell floor polish, old hymn books, and the warm, dusty scent of summer grass beyond the churchyard wall. Mrs. Harbury arrived carrying a basket of linen and an expression of composed animation. She moved at once into the center of things, not from greed for attention, but because she had trained herself never to hover uncertainly at an edge. Certain women make authority look so natural that one forgets the labor which has gone into learning it. She praised the vicar's wife's list, sympathized with Mrs. Dorrington's swollen ankle, and proposed that the collection envelopes be tied with blue ribbon for neatness. Everybody agreed that blue ribbon would be a great improvement. Ruth Vale came later, this time not sitting, but standing near the door as though ready to leave at any moment if called. She had brought 2 jars of marmalade from her grandmother's store cupboard. Miss Marple noticed the care with which Ruth set them down, the labels old-fashioned and written in a beautiful hand that was probably Elspeth's from years ago. Such things are the remains of order in lives that have had too little of it. "How kind," said Mrs. Harbury. "Though really, Miss Vale, you should not have troubled yourself." Ruth replied, "My grandmother wished to contribute." Mrs. Harbury's smile held. "Naturally, but we mustn't let her overdo. At her age one can so easily become agitated by effort." No one objected. The words were sensible. Yet Miss Marple, threading a needle she had no serious intention of using, saw again that minute withholding. Mrs. Harbury had spoken not to Ruth but past her, as if the younger woman were only an accidental channel through which goods and messages passed. When Colonel Dace's sister later remarked that old Elspeth had always been independent, Mrs. Harbury answered warmly enough. When the vicar's wife praised Ruth's devotion, Mrs. Harbury did not contradict her. She merely said, "Yes, one must all try to do one's best in these situations," and turned to ask Mrs. Piper whether more tea should be made. It was the neatness of it that interested Miss Marple. A clumsy person reveals dislike in 100 obvious pinpricks. Mrs. Harbury revealed nothing that could be quoted. She extended kindness to exactly the right people in exactly the right measure and withheld some inward assent from Ruth Vale with such delicacy that everybody else concluded the difficulty must lie in Ruth. Later, as cups were passed and seed cake divided, Mrs. Harbury crossed to the window where Miss Marple sat and said in a low voice, "Poor Miss Vale is worn to a shadow. One feels for her very much. I do hope she won't let strain make her suspicious. Elderly relations can produce the most exhausting atmospheres." Miss Marple looked up. Arabella's expression was correct, sympathetic, regretful, discreet. And false. Not false in fact, perhaps. Ruth was worn. Elspeth might be exhausting. But the feeling behind the words was absent. The concern had been put on like an apron before answering the door. It covered what lay beneath without quite concealing its own creases. The performance of concern that strikes its audience as slightly off is almost always worth examining. Miss Marple thought, though she did not say it aloud. Instead she said, It can be difficult for the younger ones. Mrs. Harbury inclined her head, satisfied perhaps that understanding had been reached, and moved away to direct the placement of teaspoons. On her walk home, Miss Marple took the upper path by the allotments. Runner beans climbed their poles with indecent speed. Someone's onions were magnificent. She reflected that villages, like gardens, often mistake vigorous growth for health. One can have a plant with leaves polished like lacquer and roots already beginning to turn the wrong way in the pot. She tried, as was her habit, to compare the present uneasiness with older instances from life. There had been a woman in Meryton, years ago, who had spoken with exhausting tenderness about her widowed sister while never allowing the poor creature to choose so much as the color of her own curtains. There had been another who called incessantly upon a bedridden cousin and always left her in tears, though no one could ever say what had been said. Both women had relied upon the public appearance of care. Care, publicly demonstrated, is difficult to criticize. One seems ungrateful even to examine it. By the time Miss Marple reached her gate, she had come to no conclusion beyond this. Mrs. Harbury's charity might be entirely genuine, but something in the manner of its offering suggested that the appeal to aid Elspeth Vale served another purpose as well. Not money, not vanity alone, something closer to management, something like possession. She clipped a fading rose from its stem, set it in water, and decided that if one wished to understand why a person gave help in a particular direction, it was sometimes useful to observe not whom they helped, but whom they needed to keep small while doing it. Chapter 3. The first of the two gatherings which clarified matters for Miss Marple took place at the church fete-planning luncheon, held in the schoolmistress's garden because the vicarage lawn was being treated for some invasion of ants. It was one of those harmless village migrations that reveal more than fixed arrangements ever do. People sitting in unfamiliar chairs often return, without knowing it, to their truest proportions. Miss Selina Drew, the schoolmistress, possessed a narrow garden full of foxgloves and strict opinions. She gave an admirable cold collation and expected intelligent gratitude for it. The guests were arranged under two chestnut trees around tables that did not match. Mrs. Harbury came in pale lilac and a hat of modest distinction. Ruth Vale arrived without a hat at all, looking as if she had almost not come and had then made herself do so. Elspeth, one learned, had insisted. The business of the fete was unremarkable. There would be a coconut shy if the weather held. Colonel Dace wanted tombola prizes catalogued. Miss Drew objected to vulgarity in the children's races. Mrs. Harbury, with graceful firmness, reconciled everybody to a compromise in which vulgarity might proceed under supervision. She had a way of making concessions appear like improvements to the giver. Miss Marple, who was asked to sit near the elderflower cordial, accepted her position by the drinks table and listened to the shifting currents. If one was elderly, apparently absent-minded, and knew exactly when to murmur, indeed, one could be present at nearly any social transaction without seeming to intrude upon it. Ruth had been placed between Mrs. Piper and the butcher's wife, which was unfortunate, as both were talkers. She answered civilly, smiled when required, and more than once turned her head as if listening for some sound beyond the garden wall. Miss Marple guessed she was hearing, inwardly, all the small domestic anxieties she had left waiting at home. Medicine times, shopping lists, the chance of rain through cracked slates. Such inner errands make poor company of a person through no fault of their own. At coffee, Mrs. Harbury rose to speak of the Vale Appeal's progress. She did it beautifully. She thanked all who had contributed. She mentioned, with exactly the right degree of humility, that several anonymous gifts had been particularly touching. She said dear Elspeth had been overwhelmed by such kindness. Then she turned, as though by the gentlest impulse, to Ruth. Miss Vale has been invaluable in conveying our little efforts. There was a pause of approval. People smiled at Ruth. Ruth said, my grandmother has been grateful. The words were plain, but there was a slight stiffness in them, and Mrs. Piper glanced quickly toward Mrs. Harbury, as villagers do when seeking confirmation of who has misstepped. Mrs. Harberry let her smile deepen, though not her eyes. Gratitude is a lovely quality in the old. One so hates to see them made anxious. Again that same note. Again that same tiny seam. The warmth was never absent. It was merely distributed with precision, and the place where it did not go stood out more clearly each time. After luncheon, the company dispersed through the borders with cups in hand. Miss Marple found herself near the sweet peas alongside Miss Drew, who said in an undertone, "Ruth Vale is not easy, I fear. One tries." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Harberry has such patience." "Yes," said Miss Marple again, "because one sometimes learns more by agreement than contradiction." Across the lawn, Ruth had bent to examine a tray of jam jars prepared for the fete stall. Mrs. Harberry approached her with 2 tickets in hand. From where Miss Marple stood, she could not hear every word, only the tenor of them. Arabella was offering, no doubt generously, to take over some further duty. Ruth, after a moment, shook her head. Arabella's smile remained. She touched Ruth's elbow lightly, as a mother might a fretful child in company. Ruth flushed, and Miss Marple saw the girl's mouth set hard before she turned away. Mrs. Harberry then pivoted at once and greeted Colonel Dace with a charming question about bunting, as if no tension had passed at all. It was a consummate performance, but it told Miss Marple something important. Arabella Harberry did not merely dislike Ruth Vale. Dislike alone is often blunt and wasteful. She needed Ruth to seem difficult. That required a series of tiny public arrangements, offers made in the hearing of others, refusals made to look unreasonable, concern displayed so thoroughly that any resistance must appear churlish. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was management of a social picture. That evening Miss Marple took her supper early and then sat in the dusk while the garden lost its edges. When a person is arranging a picture so carefully, one naturally asks what it must not be allowed to show. Vanity, certainly. But vanity is rarely so industrious by itself. Fear is industrious. Fear waters its flower beds daily. The second gathering came 3 days later at the assembly room, where volunteers were sorting donations for the appeal sale. Books, china, linens, unwanted ornaments, and the sad parade of objects that respectable households keep precisely so they may one day give them away without remorse. Miss Marple had promised a basket of gooseberry tarts and therefore had every right to be there. The room smelled of cardboard, pastry, and old polish. Sunlight slanted through high windows and made the dust look ceremonial. Mrs. Harberry stood by the trestle tables directing categories with serene competence. Ruth was unpacking a box of household things from Vale Cottage. Several brass candlesticks, 2 framed prints, a cracked mirror. "Those need not go," said Mrs. Harberry at once, too quickly. "Really, Miss Vale, your grandmother should not part with personal possessions." Ruth said, "She wishes to. But sentiment. My grandmother has very little use for sentiment where leaking roofs are concerned." A faint silence spread around the table. Miss Marple, arranging tarts, observed without turning her head. Mrs. Harberry laughed softly, for the room. "How practical she is. Still, let us keep back anything truly valuable." Ruth looked at her directly. "There is nothing truly valuable." That was not, Miss Marple thought, entirely true. There was one framed photograph among the objects, face down, which Ruth had instinctively set apart. Miss Marple saw Arabella see it too. And there it was again. That infinitesimal delay, that smile held a moment beyond comfort, that breathless pause in the very perfection of self-command. Mrs. Harberry's hand moved toward the photograph and then away. She turned to ask Mrs. Piper whether the white tablecloths had been counted. No one else noticed. Why should they? They saw only an admirable woman managing a charitable sale. Miss Marple saw a woman who could endure old candlesticks, cracked mirrors, and every practical indignity of poverty, but not the unexpected emergence of one private relic from the Vale house. When she went home, she did not yet know what that relic meant. But she knew. as surely as she knew the scent of stewing fruit in autumn, that the trouble lay not in charity itself. The charity was real enough. It was the reason that had gone wrong. Chapter 4. If one lives long enough in a village, one learns that people reveal themselves most clearly not in moments of declared crisis, but during the ordinary mechanics of sociability. Pouring tea, complimenting marmalade, selecting hymns, asking after rheumatism. Public life offers little stages upon which character performs. Most audiences applaud whatever is easiest to applaud. A week before the benefit tea, there was a committee tea of another kind at Little Paddocks, the home of Mrs. Finch, who kept excellent china and a poor opinion of nearly everyone. She had offered her drawing room for final planning because she liked to preside over other people's arrangements while appearing merely hospitable. Miss Marple went because she had promised some notes on raffle tickets, and because she was asked. Little Paddocks was one of those houses made to seem grander by ceaseless dusting. Its drawing room contained beadwork screens, photographs in silver frames, and bowls of potpourri that smelt faintly of resignation. The chairs were placed in conversational angles that discouraged comfort. Mrs. Finch herself wore mourning for a husband dead 12 years, having found that black suited both her complexion and her temperament. Mrs. Harbury arrived 10 minutes late, which in a village sometimes means vanity and sometimes means strategy. Today it meant entrance. The conversation paused pleasantly around her, then opened again with renewed brightness. She apologized just enough to flatter the group with the value of her presence. A basket of apricots had come unexpectedly, she explained, and she had been compelled to see to their distribution among the shut-ins. There is no boast more effective than one concealed in inconvenience. Ruth Vale came last of all, breathless, having left a neighbor with Elspeth for the hour. Mrs. Finch greeted her with the kind of welcome that is really an assessment of one's shoes. Mrs. Harbury said at once, "My dear Miss Vale, you ought not to have troubled. We can manage perfectly." Ruth replied, "I am on the committee." "Of course, but one mustn't neglect family obligations for village trifles." It was beautifully done. If Ruth stayed, she might seem neglectful. If she left, she might seem unreliable. Miss Marple, adding sugar to her tea, thought that people who truly wish to spare others do not so often arrange speeches about sparing them in public rooms. The discussion concerned table layout, flowers, timing for the speeches, and whether one should display the architect's estimate. Mrs. Harbury inclined to transparency. Colonel Days preferred not to depress donors with figures. Mrs. Finch worried that children would upset the cups. Through all of it, Arabella was composed, practical, faintly self-effacing. She deferred where deference looked elegant. She led where leadership looked necessary. And always, when Ruth spoke, that same curious thing occurred. Arabella's expression became more attentive, more gentle, more visibly considerate, and less human. It was as if she had a special mask for addressing Ruth, one made to reassure observers rather than the girl herself. At one point, Ruth mentioned that her grandmother had asked whether the photograph from the mantel had been packed safely after the sorting day. Mrs. Harbury, seated opposite, said lightly, "Which photograph was that?" "My great-aunt Rose." There was a clink as Mrs. Finch set down her spoon. It was nothing at all. Yet Miss Marple saw Arabella's fingers tighten on the handle of her cup. "How touching," said Arabella. "Do keep such things. One loses so much history in these little cottages." The words were unexceptionable. But Arabella said, "These little cottages," with the careful tenderness some women reserve for cracked heirlooms they would not themselves keep in the house. Ruth said nothing. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Piper, who was present with a notebook, had begun to look interested in the vulgar way of those who feel some story moving behind the curtains but cannot yet see its shape. After tea, while hats were being collected and comments made upon the heat, Miss Marple drifted near the open window. Ruth stood there alone a moment, looking out at Mrs. Finch's overwatered hydrangeas. Mrs. Harbury came to join her. "My dear Miss Vale," she said softly, "I do hope you are not taking my practical suggestions amiss. One has only wanted to ease matters for you." Ruth turned. Then perhaps you might ask what I want eased. Arabella's smile stayed in place. When one is young and strained, one does not always know what one wants. It was a small sentence, but it was a decisive one. Not because of its meaning. Many older women say exactly such things from habit, but because of the deliberate quiet with which it established superiority while sounding compassionate. Miss Marple, who had seen schoolroom tyrannies, sick-room tyrannies, and drawing-room tyrannies of every manageable size, recognized the note. Ruth answered, with more control than might have been expected, "That is a convenient view." Arabella made no reply. She laid 2 fingers on Ruth's sleeve and passed on into the hall, where she at once became once more the village's polished benefactress. That evening there was also choir practice in the church, and Miss Marple attended as she often did when not prevented by weather or common sense. She did not sing loudly, but one can hear a great deal in the intervals before hymns begin. Mrs. Piper whispered to Mrs. Dorrington that poor Mrs. Harbury must have the patience of a saint. Mrs. Dorrington murmured agreement. Ruth, standing near the back, kept her eyes on her book and sang with a low, true voice that surprised Miss Marple. Arabella, 2 rows ahead, sang as if aware of being listened to. When the practice ended, a small scene occurred by the porch. The verger mentioned that rain had got into Vale Cottage again through the north gutter. Arabella responded instantly. "I shall send Martin over in the morning." Ruth said, "I have already asked Mr. Pritchard." Arabella turned to her with that same exquisite public gentleness. "My dear, duplications are wasteful. You must let us coordinate things. Us, not you and your grandmother. Us." Several heads turned. Ruth colored. Mrs. Piper looked sympathetic in the most dangerous possible way. Miss Marple walked home very slowly indeed. There was no puzzle as to what Mrs. Harbury was doing on the social surface. She was discrediting Ruth by means of perfect kindness. She was establishing herself as the necessary interpreter between old Elspeth and the village, making Ruth appear difficult, overstrained, and perhaps ungrateful. If the girl protested, she would seem to confirm the picture. If she did not, the picture would settle around her like dust. Why? That remained. But Miss Marple now felt certain that the answer lay behind the photograph of Great Aunt Rose and somewhere in the older soil of the village, where memory persists long after people believe it buried. There are histories in a place that do not show above ground until some new weather draws them up. She decided the next day to call upon the oldest resident in St. Honors, Mrs. Nettie Gudgeon, who had lived in the village longer than anyone and remembered everything worth remembering and a good deal that was not. Miss Marple would not ask about any present unpleasantness. She never found that useful. One asked instead about names and old houses and whose sister had gone into service where. The past, approached properly, often came up to the surface of its own accord, like fruit rising in a pan when the jam has reached the right heat. Chapter 5. Mrs. Nettie Gudgeon lived in a cottage near the mill stream with a clematis that had long since outlived discipline. She was 90 if she was a day, and had the hard, bright eyes of those village ancients who survive partly from constitution and partly from the firm belief that other people are not to be trusted with the place after them. Miss Marple had known her for years and brought, as was prudent, a jar of lemon curd and a packet of thin biscuits which Mrs. Gudgeon pretended not to want and accepted immediately. They sat in the front room where the furniture had subsided into old age along with its owner. The mantel held china dogs, an ormolu clock that had stopped permanently at 20 to 4, and several photographs browned with time. Through the open window came the sound of the stream moving over stones and the occasional exasperated cry of ducks. Miss Marple did not mention Mrs. Harbury. She spoke first of the weather, then of gooseberries, then of the sad state of modern jam, which Mrs. Gudgeon denounced with vigor. After that they discussed whose grandson had married badly, whose niece had taken to vegetarianism, and whether dahlias had declined morally since the war. Only when the conversation had settled properly into memory did Miss Marple say, as if the thought had just occurred to her, "I passed Vale Cottage this morning." It made me think of the old Vale women. There were several, were there not? Mrs. Gudgeon leaned back with evident readiness. There were 3 sisters. Elspeth was the steadiest. Rose was the pretty one. Minnie died young. Rose was in service, I think. At the rectory first. Then at Harbury House when old Mrs. Lester had it before the solicitor bought it. Mrs. Gudgeon clicked her tongue softly. Pretty girls often come to little good if no one's looking after them. Not from wickedness, you understand. From people. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, people can be very wearing. Rose never had any armor. That was the trouble. Mrs. Gudgeon adjusted a cushion behind her back. She was soft-hearted. Believed the best of folk. If anyone cried in front of Rose, she'd hand them the loaf and apologize for not slicing it. And Elspeth? Elspeth had more spine. But she was away nursing her aunt in Much Benham when the worst of it happened. Miss Marple said nothing. Silence, like slow cooking, often improves results. Mrs. Gudgeon continued of her own accord. Rose lost her place over that silver business. Though I never believed it. Silver. A brooch. Not worth what people made of it. A little enamel thing from old Mrs. Lester's dressing table. Went missing. Rose had been in the room. Another girl, Bella Pine, said she'd seen Rose lingering there odd-like. Of course Rose cried. That never helps. Makes everybody think you're guilty unless you're pretty enough to be tragic, and Rose was only village pretty. Mrs. Gudgeon sniffed. Then the brooch turned up months later in a work basket. But by then Rose's character was spoiled, and no one wanted a servant with a story attached. Miss Marple let one hand rest quietly on her lap. Bella Pine, she said. I seem to remember the name. You should. Bella married well. Not at once, mind. She was ambitious from the cradle and had a face that could arrange itself to anything. Her father kept pigs over at Heart's End. Rough people. Bella hated it. Went into service determined to come out respectable. She was clever. Learned to speak neat. Learned where to put her hands. Learned what sort of laugh suited a drawing room. Mrs. Gudgeon's old mouth twitched. And she could be kindness itself when it paid. Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Harbury was Bella Pine? Mrs. Gudgeon looked pleased at being asked to confirm what she had clearly hoped to disclose. Arabella Harbury, yes. Though there wasn't much Arabella about her then. Bella first married Mr. Tom Preece, a commercial traveler, and he drank. Died young, poor soul. After that she was companion to Mrs. Lester for a time. Then she caught Mr. Harbury, the solicitor, not the present generation, of course. Caught is not fair perhaps. Let us say she made herself suitable and he admired suitability. Did Rose ever say she was innocent? She said very little. That was another fault. Soft people often think silence looks noble. It does not. It merely leaves the field open to busier tongues. Mrs. Gudgeon lifted her teacup and frowned into it. I always thought Bella knew more than she said. She and Rose had known each other as girls. Same lane. Bella was forever sneering at Rose for thinking herself too fine. But Rose never thought any such thing. She just had nice manners by nature, which annoys the ambitious dreadfully. Miss Marple looked toward the mantel where one of the brown photographs showed 3 young women in blouses with puffed sleeves, standing stiffly in some long-vanished summer. And Rose had a child, did she not? Yes. Martha. Good, sensible woman. Worked at the dairy after Rose died. Then Martha married one of the Vale cousins over in Melbury, and that's Ruth's mother. Dead these 5 years. Miss Marple inclined her head. How sad. Life's full of it. Mrs. Gudgeon's eyes sharpened. Why'd you ask? Oh, one thinks of old village families when one sees the cottages mended up. And Mrs. Harbury has been so active over the Vale appeal. Mrs. Gudgeon gave a short, dry laugh. Yes, active. Well, Bella always did prefer doing her good works where they could be seen from the road. Miss Marple did not answer at once. After a moment she said, Did Elspeth ever return before Rose died? Yes. Too late to mend anything. Rose had gone downhill by then, lungs and worry together. Elspeth never forgave the village for taking the easy view. Nor Bella neither, I dare say. Though she kept civil. Elspeth's pride is old-fashioned. Hard as pie crust, if overworked. They spoke then of entirely different things, of the old miller's daughter who had run away with a butcher, of the proper way to bottle plums, of whether modern clergy knew enough Latin to bury anyone effectively. Miss Marple did not return to Rose, Bella, or the brooch. She left after 40 minutes with many thanks, having learned precisely what she needed and perhaps a little more. On the lane home, she walked slowly, as elderly ladies do and as thoughtful ones prefer. Nettie Gudgeon's fragments settled into place around other small observations. Arabella's discomfort at the photograph, Ruth's resemblance perhaps not in features, but in manner to some quiet old grievance, the careful public diminishing of the granddaughter, the charity directed toward the family injured long ago by Bella Pine's ambition. It was not all yet complete. One never ought to season before the stew has had time to declare itself. Still, Miss Marple felt the outline strongly enough now to know where the rest would lead. A small falsehood. A village willing to believe the useful version. A woman who had spent years perfecting goodness and never once escaped the fear of being seen as she had originally been. When she reached her gate, she stood looking at the boarders without seeing them. Then she went indoors, set the kettle on, and prepared to do what she always did when the truth was close but not yet settled. She sat down by the window and thought. Chapter 6. The afternoon was very still. Heat lay over the village and made the air beyond the window tremble faintly above the road. In the front garden the white roses were beginning to go over, their petals browning at the edges in that quiet, shabby way of beauty finishing its course. Miss Marple sat in her chair with her hands folded, and because no one was there to speak to, she had no need to arrange her thoughts for anyone else's hearing. They moved in her mind with the patient order of ingredients laid upon a kitchen table before cooking begins. It had not begun, she thought, with malice. That was the point that people so often missed. The village liked its villains simple and its saints polished. But life rarely prepared character in such clear separate bowls. More often one started with some tiny compromise, some little cowardice hardly larger than a spoonful of salt. And by the time years had done their simmering, the whole dish had taken its taste from that one addition. Bella Pine, a girl ashamed of her beginning. One had seen it often enough. Shame about family, about money, about rough voices at the table, about a mother who scrubbed steps or a father who drank or shouted or kept pigs too near the house. There was nothing wicked in the shame itself. It was painful and common and, in youth, often desperate. A clever girl in service would see at once what counted in houses not her own. Tone, restraint, good linen, small silver, the art of speaking as if one had never in one's life reached across a table for the bread. She would learn. Bella had learned. Learned perhaps better than those born to it, because the self-taught always practice harder. She had trimmed herself into acceptability, clipped off rough syllables, cultivated gratitude, composure, delicacy. She had planted a new self and trained it up a trellis. Then Rose veiled beside her, pretty in the soft, careless way that has no knowledge of its own effect, well-mannered without effort, not grand, not ambitious, simply easy where Bella must calculate. That sort of ease can wound the striving far more sharply than open contempt. If Rose had also known Bella from childhood, had remembered the lane, the pigs, the noise, then Bella would feel permanently visible in her presence. Not accused, merely seen. And for some natures there is nothing more intolerable than the company of someone before whom one cannot perform improvement. A brooch goes missing. Something small, perhaps misplaced, perhaps borrowed, perhaps even taken by another hand entirely. Suspicion begins. Bella, who need only fail to defend Rose, perhaps need only offer one gentle corroboration. Yes, she had seen Rose near the dressing table. Yes, Rose seemed upset. Yes, one hated to say such things, but duty was duty. Such little statements are the yeast of disaster. They rise invisibly and change the whole loaf. Bella may never have intended the full ruin. Few people do. She likely meant only to save herself from some old embarrassment, to divert notice, to secure her own improved standing in the household, and perhaps with Mr. Harbury watching from somewhere nearby. Then the village did what villages do. It preferred the useful explanation. Rose cried. That looked guilty. Bella remained composed. That looked honest. And once the wrong conclusion is folded into local memory, it sets like jam. After that, what choice had Bella Pine, later Arabella Harbury, felt she possessed? To confess would be to return at once to the old self she had labored to bury. To say that Rose had been innocent, that she herself had shaded the truth, that her respectable marriage and all that followed stood partly on another woman's spoiled name. That would mean being seen clearly, not merely as ambitious, which society forgives when crowned with success, but as frightened, grasping, common in the cruel village sense, and morally compromised at the very root. So she had done what many such people do. She built. She built carefully. A good marriage. A corrected voice. Useful committees. Donations. Flowers to the sick. Attention to mourning customs. Baskets at Christmas. Anonymous gifts. Public kindness. Private efficiency. Years and years of architecture laid over the first cracked stone. Perhaps she even came to feel genuine pleasure in doing good. Why should she not? Goodness practiced habitually often becomes partly real. One can learn generosity even while using it as camouflage. That was the saddest part and the truest. The charity was real, but the reason was not. And then time, which softens some consciences and hardens others, had delivered back to her door the very family on whose injury her own security had once advanced. Elspeth Vale in her decaying cottage. Ruth Vale returned to nurse her. A photograph of Rose still preserved. Old names in old mouths. Perhaps some remark from Elspeth. Perhaps no remark at all. It would not take much. For a woman like Arabella Harbury, who had survived by controlling every version of herself visible to others, the mere presence of the Valas in need and memory together would be unbearable. So she had done the only thing she knew. She moved first. She wrapped the cottage in public concern. She made herself indispensable. She attached her name to repairs, funds, lists, committees. She entered the Vale story not as its hidden wrongdoer, but as its guardian angel. Once inside that position, she could shape opinion. Ruth, who naturally wished to act for her own grandmother, must be made to seem overwrought, difficult, ungrateful, perhaps unstable with strain. Elspeth, old and poor, could be recast as the object of village mercy rather than the keeper of a private grievance. The appeal would improve the cottage, certainly. Roofs would be mended, chimneys repaired, groceries delivered. Arabella was far too practical to offer merely empty sympathy. But every pound collected, every basket arranged, every public expression of tender concern also mortared the wall against one simple old truth. Rosevale had been wronged, and Bella Pine had helped it happen because she could not bear Rose's existence as witness to her beginnings. Miss Marple sat very still. There had been no grand scheme at first. Only fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of being put back into the skin one had escaped. Fear of that merciless village gaze which loves improvement only so long as it never has to remember what preceded it. Over time, fear had stiffened into habit, and habit into character. Arabella Harbury no longer merely used good works. She inhabited them. She needed them. They told her, daily, who she was allowed to be. Without them there might remain only Bella Pine from Heart's End, and Bella had been afraid for so many years that perhaps nothing of her was left except the fear itself. And Ruth, poor Ruth, had been feeling the pressure of a story arranged around her without knowing its origin. Young people always suffer most from these old social manipulations because they still expect plain dealing. They believe, until experience corrects them, that kindness means what it says. Ruth had sensed something false in Arabella's attention and fought it clumsily, thereby supplying more proof for the village that Mrs. Harbury was patient and Ruth difficult. It was all terribly neat. The thought saddened Miss Marple more than it excited her. There is no pleasure, after a certain age, in detecting the machinery of human meanness. One sees too often how ordinary the mechanism is. a little dishonesty, a little cowardice, a little enjoyment in being thought admirable, then years of watering the wrong root. Outside, a light breeze touched the roses and moved on. Miss Marple remained by the window until the room had altered with the lengthening afternoon and shadows lay across the carpet like bars from an unseen gate. By evening she knew what must be done. Not exposed, not announced, certainly not told to the police, who could do nothing with it and should. There was no use in public ruin at this late date. No use in dragging a dead girl's injury before people who had helped inflict it and would now cluck over it as though innocent. Truth should go, she thought, where it belonged, to the person who had most lived under its absence. She would speak to Ruth Vale, but first she would let the picture settle overnight, because truth, like custard, is best served when fully set and not before. Chapter 7. The next morning Miss Marple did not go at once to Vale Cottage. Instead she attended to her roses, wrote 2 notes, trimmed some dead leaves from the geraniums, and allowed the village to continue its motions without interference. It is a mistake to rush at conclusions even when one is nearly certain of them. Impatience scorches understanding the way too hot, and oven ruins a careful sponge. By noon, however, she had arranged every part of the matter in her mind and knew it had not shifted in the cooling. She thought again, not in words meant for anyone else, but privately, steadily, with the kind of inward patience age sometimes grants to those who have watched enough lives bend under the same old weather. Arabella Harbury had probably told herself, years ago, that she had not lied. She had perhaps only omitted. She had perhaps only failed to remember clearly. She had perhaps only done what necessity required. Conscience is an excellent cook when asked to reduce awkward facts into a palatable sauce. A frightened young woman, having once stepped onto that smooth path, would find it easier each year to keep walking. When she married respectably, people would call her improved. When she organized parcels at Christmas, they would call her good-hearted. When she visited the ill, they would call her selfless. And all the while the original transaction would remain untouched beneath the surface. Rose ruined, Bella advanced. Not money stolen, not jewels hidden. Something smaller and in its way more enduring. A human place exchanged for another. That was why the present appeal had such urgency about it. Guilt alone would not explain the precision with which Arabella managed Ruth's public image. Plenty of people feel guilty and simply overgive. No, this was guilt fused with self-protection. If the village thought Mrs. Harbury saintly and Ruth ungracious, then should any old story stir, it would arrive already interpreted. That was the cleverness of it. Arabella was not merely helping the Vallis. She was arranging the moral backdrop against which any future revelation would be judged. Miss Marple reflected that society especially rewards the woman who ministers competently. Men are allowed other virtues and defects. Women, particularly in villages, are praised for usefulness dressed in tenderness. Arabella had understood that long ago. She had cultivated not charm exactly, nor affection, but the appearance of tireless benevolence. It was armor fashioned from casseroles, condolence notes, and committee minutes. Very effective armor, too. No wonder no one wished to see the seam. And yet there is always a seam. It appears in distribution. A performance directed at an audience will sometimes fail in its treatment of the one person who matters most. Arabella was warm to everybody except Ruth, because Ruth was not audience. Ruth was danger. Before danger one cannot quite continue acting. One overacts instead. One smiles too long. One offers help too publicly. One touches the sleeve just once too often. One speaks over the head of the person one most needs to control. All the tiny signs had been there from the first afternoon in the vicarage garden. Miss Marple also considered Ruth herself. The girl had likely inherited not only Rose's position in the village tale, but Elspeth's pride. That made her vulnerable to the precise sort of social pressure Arabella exerted. She would resist openly, believing directness sufficient. But direct resistance to expert performance only gives the performance contrast. One sees it in kitchens as much as drawing rooms.